In our parasha, we learn the source for the idea that you may not travel a great distance on Shabbos. Now, that conversation is brought up at the end of the tractate Eruvin, and in an examination of this, and as a siyum of Eruvin, the Rebbe is going to teach us some incredible principles, not just about the laws of Shabbos and specifically the laws of carrying, but about the entire concept of how Judaism works and how we derive that from the core principles of Shabbos. So here's the source. Ala pasuk, al yetze ish mimakoyme b'yom hashvi, commenting on the pasuk that says that a person may not leave their space on the seventh day. Amar Azal v'huva b'Pirush Rashi, the Gemara says, and it is also brought in Rashi on our parasha, Elu alpayim amer shel tchum Shabbos, that mekoymoi, the space of a person that the person may not leave over the course of Shabbos, that refers to the distance of 2,000 amos, and that's the maximum distance outside of a settlement that a person can travel on Shabbos. Hainu shemi pasuk ze lamdo ha'isur lotzeis chutz litchum shel alpayim amer min ha'ir b'Shabbos. In other words, this is the pasuk that lends itself to the principle that a person may not travel beyond a certain distance outside of a settlement on Shabbos. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about, the concept of Tchum Shabbos, the barrier, the city limits, how far a person can move on Shabbos, and how you can get around it. There's a debate between Rabbi Shimon and the other sages as to exactly one of the details of how this all works. So we know that a person may not travel beyond 2,000 amos past the city limits on Shabbos, and likewise if a person arrives from outside of the city and they do not reach within 2,000 amos by the time Shabbos comes in, well, then they're stuck pretty much where they are. And that's the debate in the Mishnah between Rabbi Shimon and the sages. Says the Mishnah, Misha hechshi chutz litchum, afilu ama achas lo yikonis. According to the majority view, if a person is on his way home from wherever it is and arrives as it gets dark, and now it's Shabbos, and the person is not yet within the 2,000 amos that you may travel on Shabbos, even if it's just one amma, like a few steps distance, that's it, he's stuck and he may not enter the city limits on Shabbos. Rabbi Shimon disagrees. Rabbi Shimon oimer afilu 15 amma yikanes she'einam shuchas mematzes hamidus mipnei hatoyin. Rabbi Shimon has a very interesting view. He says the surveyors, the engineers of the city, when they determined these tchumin, these barriers, these boundaries of Shabbos, they weren't absolutely precise because they know that people are not so precise, and so the markers that they put for tchum Shabbos have leeway built into them. Therefore, if a person is within 15 amos of the marker that indicates the end of the city limits, they would still be allowed to enter on Shabbos. Pirush, that means Rabbi Shimon soiver shekshemoidim u'mesamnes hamokim shbo mistayim alpayim amma meha'ir ein mematzin samidus lahatziv asim v'soif alpayim amma. As the Gemara explains, Rabbi Shimon is of the view that when they measured out the 2,000 amma radius around a city, they did not put the markings of that 2,000 ammas at a precise location. They dafka left leeway in case people make mistakes. And therefore, in Rabbi Shimon's view, they actually brought the markers in 15 amos away from the limits, because people are mistaken and they don't necessarily always pay attention. They might miss the milestone. And what will happen is, sometimes a person will take a stroll on a Shabbos and they won't pay exact attention and they'll go further than they should without realizing they say, oops, and I have to come back. So they build in this special catch-all, this ability to mark areas that have a buffer zone. So in case you make a mistake, you can still get your way back. Therefore, using the same logic, and therefore Rabbi Shimon's opinion is that even if a person should go a whole distance away from where they're meant to be, and they kind of step outside of the city, it's okay. They can still bring themselves, they can still consider themselves within the tchum. So in other words, you look at the barrier indicates that you've crossed that threshold, you actually haven't. Now, the time Zesh Rabbi Shimon Emma Boyfen Shal Klal b'Mishnah Achronos Masechta Soperek Yud. Now, this is in Perek Dalet, the 4th chapter. The principle is raised again right at the end, literally right at the end of the Masechta in the 10th Perek, and there it's presented almost as a general rule. Rabbi Shimon Omer, and this is how the general rule goes. Rabbi Shimon says, "Mokim she'tilu l'cha chachamim," any place where the Chachamim, where the sages allowed you certain leeway, mishelcha nosnu lecha. They give you leeway in areas that are already yours. We'll explain shortly what that means. And then he says what appears to be a second point, shelo hitira lecha elo mishum shvus. They only permitted you to do these particular things because it's shvus, meaning to say it's not something which is a transgression of Shabbos as far as the Torah is concerned. It's only a rabbinic law. Now, right now, these are kind of obscure statements, and we're going to understand what they mean. The Gemara tells us that in using these two phrases, Rabbi Shimon is actually teaching us the halachos of two different scenarios. The first principle that Rabbi Shimon said, which is when the sages permitted you to do something, they permitted you within the context of that which is already yours. That is koy al adin, and now that relates to the halacha we've just looked at. That's relating to the halacha that Rabbi Shimon is of the view that if a person arrives in a city and it's already Shabbos, but he arrives within 15 amos of the city limits, he may enter the city limits. So he explains the logic behind it. You're already in your own space, because as far as Rabbi Shimon is concerned, that 15 amos is a buffer zone. So if you're inside those 15 amos, you're actually inside territory that you're allowed to walk through on Shabbos. Therefore, the sages gave you the rights to be able to go all the way through to the city. And therefore basically what Rabbi Shimon is saying is there's no major surprise over here. The rabbis have allowed you to do something which technically you are actually allowed to do. They've allowed you to continue your journey into the actual city itself, because the buffer zone meant that once you crossed the 15 Amor mark, you were actually technically within the Tchum Shabbos. So they gave you what is already yours. What's the second phrase that Rabbi Shimon used? That they only permitted you to do things which are of a rabbinic nature. The concept that Rabbi Shimon then continued to say that the sages only permitted you to do something which is shvus, which is only rabbinically prohibited, that's koyal din acher. That relates to a completely separate halacha which we have not yet learnt, which is discussed over there in the final chapter of Eruvin. What's the Mishnah? So here's what the Mishnah says. You're allowed to tie a thread inside the Beis HaMikdash, but not in the rest of Israel. And in either case, if you initially chose to do so, you wouldn't be allowed to do so. So in other words, under certain circumstances, you may be allowed to, in the Beis HaMikdash, tie a knot. Well, we'll see if it's a knot. So then commenting on this, the Gemara quotes a Brisa, and in that Brisa is our protagonist, Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Shimon says this: what happens if you've got somebody who is a Levi, and one of the jobs of the Levim was to play music in the Beis HaMikdash? This fellow is playing a kinnor, he's playing a harp, and one of the strings snaps. Is he allowed to fix the string on Shabbos? And Rabbi Shimon says no. You may not, you only may create a bow, so you can't tie it with a proper knot in order to fix the instrument, but you could use a bow. And it's to that Rabbi Shimon used his expression where he says, the rabbis only permitted you to do those things which are rabbinic in nature. So basically Rabbi Shimon says, as the Gemara explains, tying a bow which will never transgress Shabbos for real, so the rabbis allow the Levi to be able to fix his instrument using a bow. But tying a knot potentially could transgress one of the 39 forbidden activities on Shabbos, and therefore, even though it's in the Beis HaMikdash and the Levi needs it, etc., we will not permit him to tie a knot to fix his instrument. Okay, so what do we got right now is two what appear to be unrelated halachas. One about the Tchum Shabbos and whether you can enter the city limits if you get into that buffer zone as it's dark on Friday evening. And what appears to be a completely unrelated halacha, what do you do with a broken harp inside the Beis HaMikdash? So Rashi shows us a link between them. Rashi says as follows. This is what Rabbi Shimon addresses to the anonymous author of the Mishnah, that basically what Rabbi Shimon was saying, you might think, look at the story of the Tchum Shabbos. There I was very lenient. I allowed a person who ostensibly is outside of the city limits, I still allow him to continue on his journey into the city because he was in what I consider a buffer zone. And yet, when it comes to tying the string of the harp, now suddenly you see that I'm really strict about it. Why? So he says, I'll explain to you. So Rashi says that's exactly what Rabbi Shimon wants to achieve. He wants to show a distinction between the two cases. He wants us to understand that the first case is a scenario where you're actually within your rights. Therefore, the rabbis extended you a lifeline and they allowed you to continue your journey. Whereas here in the case of the Beis HaMikdash, yes, there are certain activities that are permitted in the Beis HaMikdash that you could not do at home on Shabbos, but those are only Shavuos rabbinic activities. And considering over here that the issue of tying a knot is not a rabbinic issue, therefore, says Rabbi Shimon, although I was so lenient in the other case, in this case, I'm actually pretty strict. So Rashi sees Rabbi Shimon's approach as saying, I have two different ideas about two different scenarios, and please don't confuse them. Tosfos, on the other hand, sees it differently. Tosfos says there's one theme that runs through both of Rabbi Shimon's views. Of Tosfos writes as follows: "The hasam lav kulahu ela mishilcha nosne lecha, vegam kan lo nosne lecha ela mishilcha. Dahainu ani v'davar hamuter." As far as Tosfos reads it, Rabbi Shimon is saying, I'm consistent. Because in both cases, I believe that the rabbis extend to you the opportunity to do something that you are allowed to do. In the case of the Tchum Shabbos, because there is a buffer zone, I believe that you're allowed to continue walking because you're technically in the city limits, so there's no problem. In the case of fixing the harp, if you use a bow, that is permitted, so there's no issue. The rabbis are allowing you that which is permitted. So therefore, from the perspective of Tosfos, unlike Rashi said the motivation to allow you to continue walking on Friday evening is one thing, and the prohibition against tying a knot on the harp is a different concept. According to Tosfos, it's the same idea. We'll allow you to do things that are not transgressions. So we're going to raise a question both from Rashi's perspective and from the perspective of Tosfos. But so this doesn't seem to make sense. L'shitas Rashi, ma'u akisher ben beis dinim shonim elo. So if you go with Rashi's view, Rashi is saying it's one logic that applies to Tchum Shabbos and a different logic that applies to fixing the instrument in the Beis HaMikdash. So then what is the connection between these two cases and why are they discussed together? According to Rashi, Rabbi Shimon has to tell us that although I'm strict here, I'm lenient there, or other way around. Although I'm lenient there, I'm strict here. What logic would prompt you to believe that just because there is space to allow a leniency for the person who's trying to get home for Shabbos, that automatically would make you believe that there should be a leniency when it's time to fix an instrument in the Beis HaMikdash? They're different scenarios, different cases. Why would you ever think that the one reflects on the other? And Rashi seems to believe that they're two different cases, and yet they do reflect on each other. Why? Whereas if you go according to the opinion of Tosfos, you'll have a different question. Why? Because Tosfos is of the view that it's the same logic that caused Rabbi Shimon to permit you to walk home once you've entered the buffer zone by the time Shabbos comes in, is the same logic that allows you to tie a bow, not a knot, when you have to fix the instrument. Also kosher. If it's true what Tosfos is arguing, that Rabbi Shimon has a singular motivation for both halachos, then the singular motivation is that the rabbis entitle you to that which is actually already yours, that which is already permitted to you. Stop there. Because that same logic would be both why you're allowed to continue walking into the city once you've crossed the buffer zone area, and it would be the logic why you may only put a bow, not a knot, to fix the instrument. So why then, if it's all the same logic, does Rabbi Shimon have to insert what appears to be another logical motivation, namely that the rabbis only permit things that are of a rabbinic nature? How does Tosfos explain the need for Rabbi Shimon to give a second motivation for why it is that you may only tie a knot in your instrument on Shabbos? We know that the Mishnah generally is as succinct as possible. Stick with the first reason, it applies to both, and that should have settled it. We also have another question. Divrei Rabbi Shimon Eil Nistru Kasiyuma Shal Mishnah Yisekes Bedin Sheret Shenimtza B'Mikdash Chulei. If you have a look in the context in the end of the 10th parak of Eruvin, Rabbi Shimon's comments follow a discussion in the Mishnah. What do you do if you find a creature that is sheretz, one of the 8 creatures that can make a person impure, and you find it inside the Beis HaMikdash on Shabbos? How do you dispose of it? So now, what is the connection between a discussion around an objectionable creature in the Beis HaMikdash and the harp or the Shabbos city limits? So one of the two things should have happened. Either the Gemara should have, or the Mishnah should have laid out the order of events where we discuss the issues of Tchum Shabbos and the broken harp close to each other, or at the very least take this and put it in an independent Mishnah where it's not under the same banner as the story of getting rid of the sheretz from the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, so there are certain things about the story that clearly we need to clarify. So it's a fascinating angle that the Rebbe will take over here. In order for us to understand all of this, let's go back to the idea of Tchum Shabbos. Yes, the Torah allows me that should I wish to go for a long walk on Shabbos, and it's going to be further than the 2,000 Amma limit outside of the city, then I'm allowed to make what's called an Eruv Techumin, which means that before Shabbos, either myself or I send somebody, and we drop some food at a certain point, and that extends the range of how far I could walk on Shabbos. So great, if you'd like to do it, do it. Likewise, let's say you have a whole lot of people who live in a complex, in a compound, and they all share a common space. Now, you can do whatever you wish in your house on Shabbos, but you are not allowed to carry into that common space on Shabbos unless you make an Eruv. And the Eruv then allows all the people living on the same property to share the common areas and to take things from one person's home to the other, or by extension, a Shituf Mevuos, which is the one, Shituf Mevoyos, which is what we colloquially today call an Eruv, a controversial element of some neighborhoods, to allow you to carry on the streets on Shabbos. Okay, great, so these are good things. You're allowed to have them. But it's interesting that the Shulchan Aruch speaks about a motivation why you should dafka have them. You know, it's not only allow yourself the possibility, but you should dafka have them. Why? Says the Torah in the Shulchan Aruch, Shul tzorech hanosei kidei letayel o lo havi tzorech achilosei v'zeh mitzvah k'mo shekosav v'karasa Shabbos oinek. So the motivation why it's actually a good idea to create these scenarios where you can carry is because part of the mitzvah of Shabbos is to enjoy Shabbos. And part of enjoying Shabbos is that you should be able to take food from your neighbor, bring it to your house, or vice versa, and that will add to your enjoyment of Shabbos. Okay, so in other words, there's a concept that we motivate to create a scenario that a person's Shabbos experience will be more enjoyable. Now think for a moment about the guy who's stuck outside the city limits. How enjoyable is his Shabbos going to be? So we should apply the same logic to our scenario. Shemishum oineg Shabbos mitzvah limatzei besoich tchum ha'ir kedei letayel or lehavi v'chule b'chol shetach ha'ir v'alpayim ha'mim michutz l'chol ruchoiseha. It's part of the enjoyment of Shabbos to have freedom of movement in your city and freedom of movement within a 2,000 amma range around your city, and perhaps even further than that if you make the Eruv. But if a person is stuck outside of the city limits, he's incredibly limited in terms of how much movement he could have, if at all, and therefore he cannot enjoy Shabbos. Think about it for a second. Maybe he doesn't even have all the provisions that he needs. So what kind of a Shabbos is that going to be? Stuck in the middle of nowhere without people, you can barely move and you can barely eat. Doesn't really sound like it's correct. And the whole goal of Shabbos, and this is written in Torah, is that you're supposed to enjoy Shabbos. ועל פי זה יש לומר, דזה שהחשיך לתחום, מותר לו עליו גם אם שחייב להיכנס לשיח העיר. So now we can argue quite an interesting argument that the guy who is stuck outside of the city limits is actually required to enter the city limits so that he can have a proper Shabbos. In other words, he now has an obligation to enter the city so that he doesn't consistently, throughout the whole of Shabbos, transgress the idea that he's supposed to be enjoying Shabbos. You hear this? So there's actually a motivation to say, you know what, you should never have done this. And by rights, you're not allowed to enter the city. But there's an argument to say you should dafka enter the city so that you don't protract the concept of having a miserable Shabbos. Now, based on that, we're going to observe something about Rabbi Shimon's thinking, which is Rabbi Shimon says we are going to focus more on the quantity of how much Shabbos you would undermine, rather than to focus on the quality, how severe of a rule would you undermine. So we can now say that Rabbi Shimon's approach and attitude to this particular halachic dilemma is based on a significant general principle that he believes, which is vehi sheriboy hakamos b'miut ha'eichos machria as goydel ha'eichos b'miut hakamos. That we would rather consider something which has many times that something happens over something that is of greater impact. And we'll see exactly what that means in this example, and from that extrapolate to the other examples, because now we understand Rabbi Shimon's shita. We understand his approach to a range of halachas, not only this one. His approach is we will always consider multiple transgressions as a bigger issue than great transgressions, with a caveat that we'll get to later. So, Rabbi Shimon's argument who says the guy who is outside of the Tchum Shabbos should enter the Tchum Shabbos, in fact, the wording that Rabbi Shimon uses is yikones, go ahead and enter, not mutar likones, he may be allowed to enter. No, yikones sounds almost like an instruction, which implies that Rabbi Shimon feels quite strongly about this. It's because Rabbi Shimon says the longer this guy is sitting outside of the city limits, he is actually transgressing the Torah's imperative that Shabbos should be an enjoyable experience. And every minute that he's miserable because of his circumstances, he's transgressing that injunction. But if you sit now you'll argue, hey, what do you mean? If I tell this guy to walk into the city limits, I'm telling him to proactively transgress. Go and break the law of not traveling, which is stated in the Torah, beyond a certain limit. So you're telling him to do something which is severe and intentionally. Why don't you rather just tell him, stay put? Shev al taseh. Sometimes it's better just to be inactive, to be completely passive. And yes, what the results will be is less than admirable. But that's okay because you're not actively doing something and not enjoying Shabbos, although it's something you should avoid. It's not a train smash. In spite of the fact that you're encouraging somebody to proactively break a Torah law, Rabbi Shimon is quite confident to say it almost as an instruction, go ahead and do it. Yikones, go across that boundary. Why? Because Rabbi Shimon says, yes, you're going to cross that threshold into the city limits and you will break Shabbos proactively once. But if you sit outside of the city, yes, you will be passive, but the fact of the matter is that you'll be undermining Shabbos again and again and again for 24 hours. As far as Rabbi Shimon is concerned, and that's what he wants us to know in this halacha, the amount of times that you would do something wrong outweighs the severity of a singular thing that you may do wrong on the other end of the scale. Now we understand Rabbi Shimon's thinking, let's apply it elsewhere. The time now that we know that Rabbi Shimon's motivation to tell the person enter the city limits is because rather do one big avera once than a whole lot of small averas a number of times. So now you've an akisha shebein beis haklolim shama betam beis haloches haklal mokem shehitiru lecha chacham mishachon nasu lecha vehaklal shelo hitiru lecha ela mishum shvus. Now we can start to correlate the two motivations that Rabbi Shimon gave that apparently seem to be unrelated. Well, guess what? It turns out that they are related. The one he said was, when the rabbis permit you to do something, it's because it's already within your rights. And the other that he said was that they only permit you to do something which is shvus of a rabbinic nature. Both of these talk to the same essential point. Let's go to the story of fixing the harp. There are two potential ways you could fix it. Kishur va'aniva, tie a real knot or tie a temporary bow. Now each approach gives us a problem that the other doesn't have. The problem with tying a knot is that a knot would be qualitatively more serious. That would be one of the 39 prohibited laws of Shabbos. So if you tied a knot, you would do it once, but it would be a mega transgression. Whereas to tie a bow is something that you're permitted to do as far as the Torah is concerned, and perhaps the rabbis will forbid it. And the reason that there's lenience about a bow is because bows don't last, as opposed to a knot. And the Torah only prohibits tying something which is of a lasting nature. But that's exactly the reason why, on the other hand, tying a bow might be worse than tying a knot. Because by nature, if a bow is not as constant, is not as tough as a knot, well, then you can expect that it's going to come undone and you're going to keep tying the bow. So you might be playing your harp and tying the bow multiple times. So, which one do you count? The high value transgression of tying a knot, or the multiple transgression of retying a bow a few times? So how Rabbi Shimon would look at this particular halacha would come back to the same fundamental shita principle of what's the bigger issue? The quality, the severity of the transgression, or the frequency of the transgression? But now, once Rabbi Shimon has shown us that in the case of the person who is stuck outside of the city limits, Rabbi Shimon feels that he should dafka walk in, transgress once, and have the rest of the Shabbos as it should be. The hakamus machras, that the amount of times that you do something wrong is the key factor to consider. So now, hare hasvaro neisene shegam bedino shel nima sakiner yitzadei la'atir dafka al dekshira hamoetes bekamus veloy al yidei aniva beriboy akamus hamachria. You would think, using logic, oh, I get it. Now I know how Rabbi Shimon thinks. Rabbi Shimon says do one bigger sin once rather than a smaller sin multiple times. So you would think that Rabbi Shimon says tie a knot to fix your instrument rather than keep bowing it again and again and again through Shabbos. That's what you'd think now that you've come from the place where Rabbi Shimon has illustrated that the amount of times you do something wrong is the key factor. So Rabbi Shimon has to respond to that and say, don't jump to that conclusion. Don't think that just because in the one scenario I looked dafka at the quantity rather than the quality of the averis, and therefore I do the same over here. No, that was shvus. The entire conversation only involved rabbinic laws, because the 2,000 amas of Shabbos is a rabbinic law. Yes, there are three opinions about exactly how it works, and is it actually from the Torah, is it just alluded to in the Torah, is it completely rabbinic? We're not going to get into that right now. We're going to go with a simple understanding, which is that it's 12 mil, that is the deraisa, the Torah's prohibition of range outside of the city, and here we're talking about 2,000 amos, which is rabbinic. So the entire conversation over there was shvus. That's where I say we consider the multiple sins over the single sin. Whereas over here, says Rabbi Shimon, even though I was really lenient in the case of the Shabbos limits, so as not to create a scenario where you break Shabbos again and again and again and again, even though all you're breaking is the prohibition against, the instruction to enjoy Shabbos. Mikol mokoy machmir ani beichashol kshira veineni mitira bichdei lamayit hakama shel hanivis. But yet you will find that when it comes to the scenario of the broken musical instrument, now suddenly I don't follow the exact same logic and automatically say, look at the amount of things that could happen versus the single thing that will resolve the issue. Because it has to be a scenario where we allow these leniencies. It has to be a scenario where the entire range of options are all of the same halachic nature. Either they're all rabbinic or they're all Torah based. שכלל זה שהקמוס מכריע את האיכוס איננו במקום ששתיהם שתייכס לסוג אחד של איסור, בסוג איסור דרייסה ובסוג איסור דרבנן. Rabbi Shimon wants us to be absolutely clear. If I have a toss-up between two choices, one will involve multiple forbidden actions, and one will involve a single but more serious forbidden action, I only weigh them up against each other if both options are either deoraisa or both options are either derabanan. Now here you're offering me tying a knot, which is d'oraisa, the Torah prohibits it, versus tying a bow, which is only, if anything, rabbinically prohibited. So therefore, Bashen betikkun gakinor shein bekoicha sheriba kamastani v'shim drabonon nachriya sa'echel shel kshira shasi l'dei raisa v'yaderaba ha'echel shel deraisa machrasa sakamas derabonon. Therefore, Rabbi Shimon says, in this case, because we only allow you to use a derabonon multiple to override a derabonon severe. In this case, you're dealing with a derabonon multiple against a deoraisa severe. Tying a knot is deoraisa. There's nothing to discuss. We have to be strict, and we have to say, you tie that bow. Yes, you're going to do it again and again and again, but at least you're not transgressing a deoraisa. Now, we're actually going to prove that there is such an approach in halacha from a statement of the Alter Rebbe in his Shulchan Aruch. The Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch is going to talk about two scenarios where you have to prepare some kind of food or drink for a person on Shabbos because the person is unwell. In one scenario, we're dealing with a deoraisa problem, and in the other scenario, we're dealing with the derabanan problem, and look how it comes across differently. So, let's say you have a person who's deathly ill, and we now have to break Shabbos for that individual. If that person needs meat in order to save their life, we shecht an animal for them. Shechting, you're not allowed to slaughter an animal on Shabbos. But and we don't say, let's rather feed him meat from a kosher animal that has been killed in a non-kosher way. Go to your local non-kosher butcher and get some beef. Why? Shehi iser lav. You'd say eating non-kosher food, although prohibited in the Torah, is not as strict as breaking Shabbos. Val nechalel alav Shabbos she is a skilla. So you might think, let's rather feed him non-kosher, which is a less serious halacha than breaking Shabbos, which is a skilla. It's a capital offense. Says the Alter Rebbe, so what happens? Why do we dafka give the person shechted kosher meat and not treif? Because treif, says the Alter Rebbe, he'll do an avera every single bite that he takes. Shechting, you'll slaughter the animal once, you'll break Shabbos once, yes, admittedly a more severe sin than the non-kosher food, but it's once. Rather do the one thing than do multiples of something lesser. And then he says, but let's say that the person needs boiled wine for whatever reason, that's the medicinal need that they have. Then in that case, you get a non-Jewish person to boil up the wine, because yes, there's a problem with a non-Jewish person touching the wine. It becomes stam yenom, which is a rabbinic prohibition, because once upon a time wine was involved in all sorts of pagan practices, and if you knew that somebody had actually served idolatry with wine, then the Torah would prohibit it. But the rabbis expanded that to include any wine that is handled by a non-Jewish person. So now, what are the choices? The Jew lighting the fire, that's going to break a Torah prohibition, or the non-Jew doing it, in which case every time the guy drinks a little bit of wine, he's breaking a rabbinic prohibition. Well, there you can see it quite clearly, that the Alter Rebbe says, in Shulchan Aruch, practical halacha, that we always consider multiple lesser one serious sin rather than multiple lesser sins if they're equated, a doraisa versus a doraisa. The minute there's a dirabanan involved, getting a non-Jewish person to handle the wine, let him rather do that rather than us doing a serious sin. So it's clear, according to the Alter Rebbe, that eating non-kosher again and again and again, the oraisa is still better. Is not as serious as breaking Shabbos to shecht an animal. Yes, but both of them are doraisa. Do the one that is once and get it done, and we'd prefer that. However, mashenkin b'isur shel stam yenam shehud d'rabbanan shegam oifnoi hu b'riba akamas geosa isa b'chol shtia machriya ha'eichus deraisas riba akamas d'rabbanan. Whereas in the second scenario, where your choices are to break Shabbos as the Torah is concerned, by boiling up the wine, rather let the non-Jewish person come along, which is a dirabanan, even though every sip that the person takes is a sin. So now we see it clear. This is Rabbi Shimon's thinking. If there's a debate in equal standing between quality and quantity, quantity trumps. If, however, they're not equal standing, one is a rabbinic law and one is a doraisa law, we'll always rather break the rabbinic law. Which helps us to understand why it is that the Gemara chose to talk about this scenario with Rabbi Shimon in the same Mishnah as the conclusion of a Mishnah that has to do with a sheretz creature that is found inside the Beis Hamikdash on Shabbos. And it was not allocated into its own Mishnah. We know that the design of Mishnahs is very precise. The splitting of how the Mishnahs were divided, which subjects on which Mishnah, is very precise. The fact that they're both in the same Mishnah is because they both speak to the same fundamental principle that Rabbi Shimon wanted to teach us. Because believe it or not, the first part of the Mishnah talking about when you find this sheret lying on the floor of the Beis Hamikdash actually speaks to the same principle that Rabbi Shimon wants to address. Kamus beriba hazman machria, oy echos begeidel ha'inyan atzmoi machria. It's the same debate. Do we look at the quantity? How long? How many hours of impurity will there be inside the Beis Hamikdash? Versus how severe will the nature of this impurity be? In other words, will it now be transmitted to a person or the clothing that he's wearing, etc.? Here's the language of the Mishnah. Sheretz shenimtze b'mikdash kohen metzia be'em yonah sheloi lehashois es atume divrei Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika. So the Mishnah over there says, what happens if you find the sheretz inside the Beis Hamikdash? What do? We send a kohen and we let the kohen remove it out of the Beis Hamikdash using his hem of his garment. And that way we don't want the impurity to stay longer in the Beis Hamikdash. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. He says, don't use your own clothing. Go get a wooden tongs. Wood will not transmit impurity in this case. And remove the sheretz with the wooden tongs. And that way, you don't have an issue of spreading to a higher degree, so to speak, a greater extent of impurity. As far as Praktasim, the Marsava Shiyutum Makamas Adif, Marsava Afshatum Eichos Adif. So what's the logic between the two opinions? Exactly the same logic that Rabbi Shimon was presenting to us. What do we focus on? The amount of something. So the amount, every minute that sheretz is lying in the Beis Hamikdash is a problem. Like every minute that guy is sitting outside of the Tchum is a problem. That's Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika's opinion. And very much Rabbi Shimon's opinion as well, as opposed to Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, which was, we don't look at how long the impurity is going to be there, we look if we're going to escalate the impurity by allowing a person to touch it directly or through his clothing or whatever, and that becomes the bigger issue, the eichos. So because the Mishnah was discussing exactly that particular issue, do we focus on the amount of negative versus the extent, the power of the negative? So that led us to the conversation of Rabbi Shimon's view, where he says if we're talking about issues of the same halachic nature, we always look specifically at the kamos, the extent, how many events of impurity or transgression will happen. That's the halacha of all of this. But it's got a deeply profound spiritual side to it too. To take a look at the two principles that Rabbi Shimon taught us, which are that the rabbis permit you to do something that is actually already permitted to you, and the principle, but they only do so in the case of Shvus. In other words, rabbis can only allow you to do things in a rabbinic nature. We certainly are not going to allow a rabbinic law to override a Torah law, even if that means that you are, you're going to do the same thing again and again and again. So let's look at this from a spiritual perspective. And by the way, it will also give us a whole different perspective on why Rabbi Shimon would like to find a way to get this person who's stuck outside of the Tchum Shabbos back inside. It's a very fascinating thing that in the list of the 39 laws of Shabbos, actually the concept of transmission from a domain to domain, from a public domain, private domain, etc., is actually the last on the list. And yet when you look in the Gemara Shabbos, it's the first topic that's discussed. And so many different insights go to the point that the story of transmission on Shabbos, taking an item from a personal space into a public space, or vice versa, is actually the core of what Shabbos is all about. And just to get a handle on that, there needs to be Medrash. Medrash tells a story, Sheshoal min echad Rabbi Akiva, that there was a particular minim were people who had kind of rejected a lot of the principles of Torah. So the min says to Rabbi Akiva, he says, I need to understand, Im kidvorecha shakadosh baruch hu mechabed Shabbos. If it is, as you say, that Hashem himself honors and respects Shabbos, so al yashev baruchos, al yerid bo gshamim, al yatzmiach bo esev. Let him not allow the wind to blow, the rain to fall, or things to grow on Shabbos, because out of respect for Shabbos, you're not allowed to do those things on Shabbos. It's actually quite a common question that children often ask. If Hashem keeps Shabbos, how come it rains on Shabbos? So this min had a similar question to Rabbi Akiva. How did Rabbi Akiva answer him? So Rabbi Akiva replied to him by using the parable of carrying on Shabbos. And he says, basically what he says is, in your own home, you're not restricted by the laws that you may not carry things. You can carry a big, heavy chest across your house, a bed, a couch, whatever you want. You're not required not to move things. In your space, you may do these things. The whole world is Hashem's space, and so he can do as he pleases. That's how Rabbi Akiva answers him. But L'chayra Tamor, which seems to be a very strange answer. V'tshuvas Rabbi Akiva muteretzes, rak hakush mimrechas haitzah mirishus lirishus. V'haloi kol sha'ar ha'malachas ein tluis b'haitzah mirishus lirishus. Apparently, the way that Rabbi Akiva addresses the issue is specific to the question of, may Hashem move something from place to place, blow the wind, so that dust flies from here to there. Is he allowed to do that on Shabbos? Well, it's all his home, he can do it. Rain? Rain is a different issue. Rain is the irrigation of things that may grow, which you're not allowed to do on Shabbos, nothing at all to do with carrying or taking things from Rishus to Rishus. And the same would apply to allowing things to grow. So how did Rabbi Akiva really answer the question? Therefore, he anakuda ha'ikris b'chol melachis ha'Shabbos, v'hi ha'yesoid v'ha'shoyre shemimenu mistafin kol ha'beis melachis tuldo sein u'shvusim derabanan. It must be that what Rabbi Akiva wanted to allude to over here is that the fundamental principle of everything Shabbos, those which are the main forbidden activities on Shabbos, and those which are the extended forbidden activities on Shabbos, and those which are the rabbinic They all stem from one core principle, and that core principle, which is the whole of Shabbos encapsulated, is the principle of moving something or not moving something from a private to a public domain or vice versa. ולכן, מכיוון שלגבי הקדוש ברוך הוא לא ייתכן עניין דייצא מרשוס לרשוס, כי כל העולם כולו שלו, במילא בטל היסוד נסינס מוקים, גם לשאר המלאכה שאינן אלא הסתפס ממלאכת היצא. So because in Hashem's reality there is no such thing as another domain. Everything is His. It's all His domain. It's all His space. So therefore the principle, the concept of Shabbos is founded on the idea of hoitzah, of moving something from one domain to another. Because in Hashem's reality there is no alternative domain, there is no outside, therefore the principle of Shabbos is not binding to Hashem in the same way as it is to us. Now we've got to really understand what that means. וזה יש גם לבואר הטעם להשכלתו של מסכת השבס, ממלאכת היצוא, אף שמלאכה זו מינוי בסוף כל אבס מלאכס בפרק זין, ולכן הבא לרבינו הקודש לפרק כל המלאכס תחילה, ואחר כך לפרשן על הסדר כקושס המפורשים. This will also help us to understand, as I touched on already, the principle of why it is that the Gemara Shabbos starts with the story of the poor man and the rich man, and whether or not you transgress by passing something from a personal space into a public space or vice versa. And only in chapter 7 does it start to list what the 39 malachas are, and there you discover that this is actually at the end of the list. So why, and many of the Mefarshim ask this question, why does the Gemara start that way? The Mishnah, why did Rabbeinu HaKadosh do that? Why? Well, now we know. It's because this is the founding principle, the core from which all the other 38 malachos derive, and we need to understand how and why and what does that mean. The explanation is Shabbos la'avaya. We need to understand that Shabbos is not exactly like everybody says, because otherwise we'd be too stressed, and what would you do without your 24 hours of downtime? And you have to be able to unplug, and it's really healthy, and side benefits. What's the real concept of Shabbos? It's a time of absolute dedication to Hashem. The Gemara tells us that a Yom Tov is kind of divided. Part of it is for our personal pleasure, part of it is dedicated to Hashem. Shabbos is dedication to Hashem. That is the principle and motivation of Shabbos. Hainu, that means to say, like the Sefer HaChinuch says, why do we have a Shabbos? To carve into our consciousness an awareness of the fact that Hashem created and creates the world on an ongoing basis. Shehu Yisborach bara es olam b'sheish mei bereishis vayom hashvi Shabbos v'yinofash v'asher ken gamach shuvu beres olam tamid mi'ayin leyesh, as Chassidus explains thoroughly that just as Hashem originally created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th, He recreates the world at every nanosecond. B'sheish mei achol v'Shabbos shevis mei adibra d'asar ma'amores v'amshachas hachayis b'Shabbos imibchinas machshava k'may b'Shabbos bereishis. And in the same way as Hashem actively created for 6 days originally and so-called rested on the 7th day, we understand that what that means is that for 6 days of the week the dynamic of creation is as if Hashem was speaking and actively pushing energy into the world, whereas on Shabbos He, so to speak, retracts to a higher reality of thought where He still actively creates the world, but from a dimension that is less, so to speak, invested and more, so to speak, spiritual. And therefore the idea of Shabbos is to recognize, for us to recognize, that Hashem is the sole proprietor, that Hashem is absolutely in control, everything belongs to Him, everything is in His control, everything is supervised by Him with hashgacha pratis, highly specific oversight at all times. There are no exceptions. There is no outside. That means to say, even though Hashem dafka designed the world, and olam, the Hebrew for world, is related to the word helem, which means to conceal. So He dafka designed the world in such a way that you could easily mistakenly believe that there are systems in place by which the world works, and it's got nothing at all to do with God. So you need vaccines against viruses, and there are seasons in the world, and there are economic patterns that happen, and it's outside of Hashem's hands. That's the way Hashem designed the world, that we should read it as naturally occurring situations and circumstances. In fact, we could even think we might even think that there are two powers at play. This is the belief system of certain other theologies, that there are two equally opposite power leaders at play over here. You might believe that there is a domain of that which is good and holy, and there is a separate domain of that which is ugly and antithetical and dark and damaging. Shekol Olam Kula Yeshus Achasi Yeshus Hayochid LiYechido Shel Olam comes along Shabbos to remind us there is a single domain. The entire reality is Reshus Hayochid. It belongs to Yechido Shel Olam, the one and only. Everything is His. Everything is under His control. There is no reality to darkness, to impurity, to ugliness. The only reality is holiness, and we've just got to recognize that. And that's got practical implications for us. So that implies that if a person disregards Shabbos, if a person transgresses the prohibitions of Shabbos, that has two effects. Number one, it causes it weakens that person's faith that Hashem is in control. Because now you're saying, maybe He's not in control, then I can do as I please. Maybe I can make decisions independently of Hashem. Number two, it causes Agboras Hahelim Atos and Al Deshter Yeshuas Chas V'Shalamin Shaloi Tzom Yeshus Hayochid. The second thing that it does is it takes our reality outside of Hashem's personal domain. It kind of it heightens that sense of there is an alternative. There is another reality. So therefore we can say that any one of the 39 prohibited activities on Shabbos are all one theme. Every one of them takes us and our piece of the world out of Hashem's Reshus HaYochid, His personal space, into a place of duplicity, multiplicity, alternatives that we believe are actually viable. That was Rabbi Akiva's intention in his response to this min, where he said the whole world belongs to Hashem. Because it's actually impossible for anything to truly obscure the truth. What's the truth? Everything is Hashem's. Even those things that appear to be negative in the world, they are in Hashem's control absolutely. And there will come a time where that will become the revealed reality, the conscious reality of our world. The Medrash tells us there'll come a time where a person goes to pick a fruit on Shabbos and the fruit will say, it's Shabbos today. It will be a glaring reality. Right now it's a reality in the library. But there comes a time in the future where this will be a glaring reality for us. There will be a time where the world will proclaim the truth that there is Hashem Echad, Shmo Echad, there's only one reality, Reshus HaYochid. We're all living in a singular domain with a singular controller, Hashem Himself. And that was Rabbi Akiva's message to this min. He says the whole concept of hoitzah, the possibility of stepping out of one domain into a different domain, which is the source and core of all the laws of Shabbos, that's not even possible with Hashem because there is no other domain to speak of. That's the truth, capital T. Mine. Kol inyonei abrin echlachim legimel sugim klolim hanirmozim begimel sugei areshus to Shabbos. Now you could take the whole world as we know it, and you could essentially divide the world into three realities, which are reflected in the three primary states of space on Shabbos, the domains of Shabbos. Aleph, number one, you have Sug Shin Yonah Kedusha, Sha'avoida B'Hemi Boifen De'oise Toiv, Devasei Toiv, Reshus HaYochid, Yechido Shel Olam. One reality of the world are things that are directly and clearly associated with holiness. Positive mitzvahs. You put on tefillin, there's no question that is a statement of holiness. You light Shabbos candles, there's no question that is a statement of holiness. You are in Hashem's domain, the Reshus HaYochid, the domain of the one and only true entity. Then, on the other hand, you have Sugshin and Yoner Rad Vorim Asurim Tura de Pruda, Shaifan Avoid Baimu Bederich Sur Mera, Reshus Rabbim Hefer Reshus HaYochid. And then there's another whole reality, things that are forbidden. the dark side of the world, what we call the Turei di Pruda, the mountains of separation. Think about it, mountains, as you go higher, so they become more distant. The peaks are always more distant from each other than the base. So that's the reality of the world that we have to avoid. Sur Merai, don't go there, don't do those things, don't speak Lashon Hara, don't eat non-kosher, don't hurt people, don't steal. That's called Rishus HaRabim. That's a place of divisiveness. Rabbim doesn't just mean the public, it means the many, those that are at loggerheads, that are ripping each other apart. And then there's Sug Shel Inyonei Rishus Shei Memutze Bei Mitzvah Li'Yisr. And then there's another reality which is kind of nishtahinu nishtaher, like a caramelis. It's not exactly personal property, and it's not exactly the diversive public space, somewhere in the middle, and that represents the concept of Inyonei Harashus, things that the Torah has not instructed me to do nor forbidden me from doing them, so therefore how I do them is going to make a big difference. I eat. Torah doesn't say you shouldn't eat, and the Torah doesn't say it's a mitzvah to eat. But how I eat could either be a tremendous mitzvah, or it could be a horrible mistake. So therefore, I have two choices of how I approach, two appropriate choices of how I should approach those things which are spiritually neutral, which are spiritually parav. One option is Aleph Kadesh Atzmo B'Mutaloch, where the Torah says, sanctify yourself through those things that are permitted. So the Torah has allowed you to eat, okay, we'll eat in a holy fashion. Say a bracha beforehand, don't gouge yourself, eat with holy intentions. Or you can even go beyond that, which is the second option. There's another alternative, which is not just to have a holy experience of these activities, but actually to elevate them, that they become a way to serve Hashem. So you don't just do business because you want to have money and then later you'll give tzedakah, but the goal of the business experience is that this is a means to serve Hashem, that every person that I meet with, somehow I bring meaning into their life and awareness of Hashem into their life, and the 7 Noachad laws if they're not Jewish, and mitzvahs if they are Jewish, etc. ודוגמאסן ברשוס דה שבס חוצר שבוי כמה דיירים ממובוי קרמס וכדומה שהם רשוס ממוצס בין רשוס היוחד לרשוס הרבים ועל ידי עירוב החצרס ושיתופם בבויוס וכיוצא בזה נאסיס רשוס היוחד. So what does that look like in the reshuyos, in the domains of Shabbos? It looks like a compound, and there's a shared space in the compound which isn't quite private and isn't quite public. Or it looks like the streets in your neighborhood, which are not large enough and don't have enough population to constitute a real Reshus HaRabim, a real public space, and therefore there's a way to create an Eruv or a Shituf Mevo'os that allows us to turn that space into a Reshus HaYochid. That means that on a spiritual level, the concept of creating an Eruv to allow me to travel beyond the range that the Torah allows me on Shabbos, or to create an Eruv that allows me to carry in places that the Torah did not allow me to carry on Shabbos, it's the same spiritual theme, meaning הגדולת רשוס ותחום האיש הישראלי רשוס הקדושה, שמצד עצמו מצומצמת היא בכמוסה, ועל ידי עבודת ועשיית הערב הרי מסגדלת ומתרחבת. They both carry the same theme of, I as a Jewish person, my space is meant to be holy, and now I'm looking to expand that holiness, to incorporate the street outside, to incorporate 2,000 extra amos of range outside of my city. So what am I looking to do with an Eruv? To take my Rishus HaYochid, where I represent godliness and I represent commitment to Hashem, and expand it outwards so it should touch, influence, and inspire the rest of the world. With that in mind, we can now link up the two different concepts that Rabbi Shimon taught us. The one is the one that he spoke about was that when it comes to that which the rabbis allow you, they allow you within the context of that which is already yours. That's what he said in the context of the person who's outside of the city limits. The second principle that he taught us was that the rabbis only allow you to do things that are of a rabbinic nature. And there he's talking about the 39 principles of Shabbos, which are all predicated, as we've already discussed, on the concept of transmission from a private to a public domain. So, same spiritual principle in both cases. Parenthetically, the Rebbe says, so this is something that we touched on a little bit before. So if you want to understand this a little bit better, let's look at the three different opinions. There are three different views of exactly how the Tchum Shabbos works. One is Gam Alpayim Amedoiraisa, that even the extent of 2,000 amos around a city is actually mandated by the Torah. As we've seen, it's based on a pasuk. The pasuk Al Yetze Ishmi Makoimoy in our parasha this week, that a person should not leave his space. The second view is Yud Beis Mil Midaraisa Alpayim Ame Midarabanan, the most well-known opinion, that only if you go to the full extent of 12 mil, which was the length of the Jewish camp in the desert, then you'll have the issue of transgressing a Torah law, whereas 2,000 amos is only a restriction that is rabbinic. And then there's a further opinion that that the whole idea of a limited range of travel on Shabbos, the entire thing is rabbinic, and it's only alluded to or has an asmachta, has a basis from wording in the Torah, but that wasn't intended as a Torah-based prohibition. Those three opinions can also be associated with the principle of Shvus. What is a rabbinic law on Shabbos? Because the Torah tells us that this is Tish Bois. It's a time that you have to rest. So what exactly constitutes rest? Aleph, one opinion is One opinion is that the Torah tells us Shvus, you have to rest. Now the rabbis were given the rights to determine what exactly falls under the category of rest. The second opinion is Yeshnan Shvusim Shemi Deraisa V'chom Pirshoisam Yeshnan Midrabanan. Another view is that certain kinds of shvus are actually from the Torah, and certain are purely rabbinic. And thirdly, calling on a shvus midrabanan, umasha kosev tishbois en elasmachta. And the third opinion is that the entire idea of shvus, which is effectively things that are not on the 39 categories of forbidden work, but similar to or associated with them, that's all rabbinic and has no Torah basis whatsoever. Okay, that's parenthetic because it just shows us that there's an halachic theme that connects the concept of tchum to the concept of shvus, those so-called peripheral or associated rabbinic prohibitions of Shabbos. We're more interested in the spiritual connection, for our conversation now, we're more interested in the spiritual connection between them. However, when you start to examine it, it would appear that there's a major fundamental distinction between the laws and prohibitions associated with the range of walk or travel on Shabbos and the concept of the other 39 melachos of Shabbos. In fact, this is such a radical distinction between them, you may actually argue that they are contradictory principles. How so? So let's look. The concept, the principle of those 39 prohibited activities is that if a person does any one of those prohibited activities, we say he is mechalel Shabbos, which means he desecrates Shabbos, and we're going to look at it from a slightly different translation. If a person cooks on Shabbos, if a person plants on Shabbos, if a person weaves on Shabbos, that person creates a gaping hole in the holiness that Shabbos was supposed to bring to the world. That's called chilul Shabbos. Chilul from the word desecrate, chilul from the word chalol, a void. You've created a void where there was meant to have been holiness. Hainu she'hamlochet b'shalidam lochet b'Shabbos machnis bonim bilti rotz machnis klippe b'Shabbos. That implies that when a person desecrates Shabbos, what they're actually doing is they're bringing an impure spirit into a holy space. It's trespass of the highest order. This is a time of the week that is supposed to be holy in every respect. And here somebody has introduced an unholy, impure energy into that space. Whereas, Isur diyatzir chutz litchum, ein zeh shu machnisin shel chol b'Shabbos. But if you walk too far on Shabbos outside of the city limits, you're not bringing something impure into the space of Shabbos. Adrabi, you're doing the exact opposite actually. What the person would then be doing is taking his Shabbos, because here it is, at Shabbos, I started it off, I davened, I sang Shalom Aleichem, I made Kiddush, I did all of these things. So I'm Shabbos, I am now in the space of Shabbos, and I'm going out into the uninhabited world, which is always symbolic of the world of impurity. Doesn't that look like the exact opposite of breaking Shabbos? Breaking Shabbos is you inject impurity into the pristine environment of Shabbos. Here, you're carrying the pristine environment of Shabbos into the wilderness. Doesn't matter who you are, what kind of Jew you might be, even the person who is the most disconnected Jew has the spark of the holiness of Shabbos inside of them, as we very well know that even an ignoramus will not lie on Shabbos because he feels something. So when a Jewish person walks outside on Shabbos where he doesn't belong, that's not just his personal thing. It's not just that he's walked too far and that's going to have some kind of an impact. That means that at this point in time he has carried the Shabbos within him into a place that is not suited for Shabbos, that is antithetical to Shabbos. Parenthetically, again, the Rebbe says, now don't make a mistake and think, whoa, hang on a second, why are you making such a big deal about a person who's taking Shabbos into a space that is not Shabbosdik? We know that it's actually a good thing to take Shabbos into a time that is not Shabbosdik. You bring Shabbos in early and you keep it in a little bit longer. So you'd say, hey, 1 second, just like the Torah allows me the possibility of expanding the time frame of Shabbos, maybe the Torah allows me to expand the space of Shabbos. Why are you making such a big deal and saying that if you go out beyond the Tchum, you're bringing Shabbos into a place of impurity? So the difference is, see, the thing with the time of Shabbos is the Torah talks about, and the Torah tells us to do it, not perhaps directly, but the Torah tells us the principle that we learn from a verse in Torah that you are actually supposed to sanctify Shabbos a little bit before and keep it in a little bit after. So if the Torah tells you to do something, then the Torah empowers you that you can successfully do it. Whereas over here, the Torah never suggests or advises that you should travel on Shabbos, on the great Shabbos roadshow, to take the Shabbos with you to the outside world. It's never even alluded to. Because the environment outside of city limits is considered off limits, it's considered impure, it's considered klippa, you're not allowed to take Shabbos into that space. Now we can also understand why Rabbi Shimon was convinced that as long as the person is outside of the outside of the city limits, it's a problem. Why? Because as long as he's there, he is holding Shabbos in an impure place. I know. Because the which actually turns out that traveling outside of the city limits, the problem is not the travel, the problem is the being in a space that is outside of the city limits, because that space is impure. So the and that's why Tosfos points out that Rabbi Shimon says his statement as an instruction, you can't get back in. Get back in where you belong, because the longer you're out there, the longer you're keeping Shabbos in a hostile environment. Get back to where you belong. It's an imperative. You've got to react. You've got to do something. So what are we saying? Breaking Shabbos is injecting impurity into Shabbos. Traveling outside of the city limits appears to be the exact opposite. It's dragging the Shabbos into a space of impurity. So, this has a wonderful lesson for us, not just relating to Shabbos, but generally speaking in how we serve Hashem. The real you is your neshama. That's the real you. That's the piece of Hashem that lives in you. That's what counts. That's the core of your being. Therefore, because you've got a spark of Hashem inside of yourself, you can make a comparison. Hashem, at his essence, is infinitely beyond any involvement, any relationship with the concept of creating a world. To the extent that the Zohar even uses the expression to say that the 10 phrases, the 10 utterances with which Hashem created the world, which for us are very deep, powerful, profound spiritual energies, as far as Hashem is concerned, it's like nonsensical, not nonsensical, but like meaningless conversation. Chatter. So a Jew who has a neshama, which is your reality, which is a spark of Hashem, has a similar reality too. A Jew in essence is infinitely beyond anything of this world. Except Hashem told us we've got to go out there and be proactive, and we have to get into the world, and we have to make an impact on the world, and that's why we have to work for 6 days. We don't belong in the world, we have a mission in the world. And in this way, we have to consider ourselves similar to Hashem. Just as Hashem had to, so to speak, contract and reduce himself in order to facilitate the possibility of a world because it's so low and meaningless and nothing compared to him. The same kind of attitude should be our attitude. When I go into the world, I'm diminishing myself. This is a step down. It's a degrading thing for me to have to engage in this world. You know who I am. You understand the power of my neshama. So a Jewish person has to be acutely aware of the fact that my engagement in things of the material world is a major downgrade. Who am I really? I am really Shabbos. Shabbos isn't what I do. Shabbos is a reflection of who I am. I am fundamentally aloof, beyond, above the world. Therefore, these two primary mitzvahs of Shabbos, the prohibition against doing work on Shabbos and the prohibition against traveling beyond the city limits, both of these laws teach me how I should engage the world all day, every day, not only on Shabbos, because I am the Shabbos, and therefore I've got to know how to look at the world. So there are two things to consider. The prohibition against work on Shabbos, we already described that the problem with working on Shabbos is you inject impurity into a holy environment. What that translates into in my world is to allow the material world into my head. My head is the fortress of my Shabbos. My head is the place that has to be pristine. It has to be focused. It has to be aware of the correct values and principles. I cannot let that world into my head. Even though I was told that I've got to be proactive and I've got to work and I've got to be a contributor to society. The work that I have to do is reserved for my most superficial abilities. But certainly not my elevated, highest, most profound abilities. My upper faculties are dedicated to Torah. Where's my head? My head's in Torah. Where's my heart? My heart's in Torah. I do things, I work, I've got a responsibility. It's what I do, certainly not who I am or where I think. Very famous concept that the Rabbi teaches, that the pasuk in Tehillim says, where do you work? Yigias kapecha, the labor of your hands, the outer part, the extremities of the body, that goes into the outside world. The head, the essence of my being, has to remain pristine. Yaakov stones around his head before he goes to Lavan. But when a person brings the mundane world into his mind, into his internal Shabbos, what happens, we already said the word chilul, mechalel Shabbos, to desecrate Shabbos, comes from the word cholol, to create a void. The person starts to feel a void of sensitivity to godliness. When a person allows the thinking of the world into their mind, they lose automatically sensitivity to the thinking of godliness. Recently heard a story where one of the mashpiyim went to the Rebbe speaking about a particular bocher who asked a particular question, and the Rebbe said, check what he reads before he goes to sleep at night, because such a question indicates that something's in the mind which shouldn't necessarily be there. If a person had absolute clarity of the truth, which is that only Hashem's bracha causes success, and all of the work that we do in business is purely just to create the vessel, the channel through which Hashem's brachas can flow. If you recognize that truth, you don't have to invest your mind and your talents and your intellect into the work. With all the scheming and ideas which ultimately actually don't guarantee anything, because at the end of the day it's Hashem's bracha that will either give a person success or, God forbid, not. In fact, on the contrary, what you think is working for you actually works against you. What you think is going to help you actually undermines you. What you believe is going to be the cause of your success, all your great schemes, distract you from Torah learning, which doesn't allow you to have an open, clear channel of bracha from Hashem. Now, some people say, I don't have this problem, Baruch Hashem. I don't bring my work home. I don't allow it to invade my space. I know how to compartmentalize. I'm good. So we have another warning as well. There's the prohibition, don't travel too far outside of the city. When it's Shabbos time, don't let your feet go, very superficial, lowly part of the human being, don't let that go where it shouldn't belong. Now, it's Torah time. Now it's mitzvah time. Now it's davening time. Be here absolutely. When you do Torah, when you learn Torah, famous thing that the Rebbe told people, that when you learn Torah, you should treat the phone as if it were Shabbos. Now, this was before there were cell phones. Can you only imagine how apt that insight is? I'm now in Torah. The outside world doesn't exist. The same thing when I daven, the same thing when I do a mitzvah. I'm not out there, some part of my mind drifting, or just checking this, or just responding to that. In Shabbos, you don't go beyond the tchum. You don't go into the outer world. As we already noted, the final Mishnah in Eruvin, which is the siyum that the Rebbe is making here, and which is where we got into the conversation about Rabbi Shimon. So the final Mishnah spoke about a sheret, this impure creature that was found inside the Beis Hamikdash, and you got to get it out. Pirish, what the Gemara is alluding to over here is that a person could go through the whole of Shabbos and the whole of Eruvin, two major tractates of Gemara, and learned a whole lot of principles and applied them into your life. So you go through the Shabbos thing, which is the principle of not allowing the outside world to invade your mind. And you go through the Eruvin principle, which is not to allow the outer parts of yourself to wander while you're focused. After all of that, it is still possible that a person might find impurity inside his place of holiness, inside his Beis Hamikdash. How? Because a sheretz is not part of you. A sheretz is an impurity because something came from the outside and trespassed into your space. We live in a world that is unfinished. Mashiach's not here yet, at least not revealed. So therefore, we live in a world where there's still impurities out there, and those impurities might sometimes fall into our space, not because we've done anything wrong, it's because of the reality we live in. So a person will say, look, it's not me, I didn't do this, it's the world I live in, I don't, and you're not responsible for it. It's not of your making. But everybody agrees you've got to remove the impurity. It doesn't matter that you were not the cause of it. If there is something untoward in your space, it becomes your responsibility to get rid of it. And the only debate is, how do you get rid of it? Do you take the approach of using your clothes? Clothes is a metaphor. To be mislabesh, to invest yourself, to really get your hands dirty, as the expression goes. When you deal with somebody who is lowly, you unfortunately become lowly yourself. So is that the approach? Immediate attack. Do whatever you can. Get your hands dirty to get rid of it so that you don't have the impurity there one moment longer, even though you might be a little bit tainted in the process. Or do you take your time, find the correct tool that will allow you the healthy distance between yourself and the sheretz, that you can remove it without any damage to self? Like the Alter Rebbe says, you should make yourself as if you don't even know that it's there. Like when the Amaretz, the ignoramus, tries to pester you in the middle of your davening, or if it happens to be your Yetzer Hara, you pretend like it's not there. So, do you delay the process of dealing with this impurity rather than allow yourself to get stuck in? So that's the debate in the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon, as we saw, seems to go with the first opinion, which is get your hands dirty, but we're not paskening over here. What we do need to know, especially in our generation, we're so close to the arrival of Mashiach. Any external barrier to Mashiach is gone. The only thing that is required is us to do tshuva. And we know that tshuva is instantaneous, so you can do tshuva in a flash. And we know that real tshuva, as the Alter Rebbe explains, tshuva from deep love of Hashem transforms the most impure into the most pure. We know how to get rid of the impurities in our lives. How? By spreading Chassidus. That's how we get That's how we get rid of the impurity in our life. That is the tshuva. That is the way that is appropriate for us at this time. That will hasten the coming of Mashiach right now, and then there'll only be a Rishus HaYachid, and we'll all be under Hashem's wing, and we'll live in a reality that is absolute clarity of godliness. There'll be no more impurity in the world. May we be zeicher to see that literally. Take care for miyad mamash immediately.